In this video, I'm looking at attempt number 4. Remember, we're looking at false judgments in the Theaetetus and attempts, that is a number of attempts to explain what a false judgment is. We've seen 3, so this is part 4, and we're at Theaetetus Stephanus numbers 190E to 196C, and in this section, we are talking about the wax example. This is a little bit different than the other examples because the other examples they didn't introduce a model or any way of understanding what the mind is. In this video, I'm going to talk about the wax example, which is a model of the mind or the soul, if you like. And in the next video, I'm going to introduce another model, the Avery model of the soul. So these last 2 attempts of trying to explain false judgments bring in the notion of a model in order to understand what we're doing when we're judging in the first place. Okay, so we've seen 3 failed attempts to explain these false judgments, and it seems roughly that the notion of a misidentification is not really going to work. In other words, misidentifying, like I just labeled with thought with a subscript 1 and thought with subscript 2, to think of errors in judgment as, confusing thoughts, right? One thought with another thought. And we saw Socrates says, well, that's pretty hard to do if you know something, a thought, and then you know another thought, and then to say that what you know is not what you know, but it's another thing or another thought, that doesn't seem to be really possible. Although we left open the door if you're totally irrational or maybe some kind of madness or whatever, maybe in that case. But a rational person doesn't seem to do that. And rational people make mistakes. So it's not that, oh, rational people never make mistakes and it's only the insane that do. No. We all make mistakes. So once again, how do we do this? What's going on? Doesn't seem that you mistake perceptions and perceptions either. So perception 1, perception 2. Although that's going to be loosened up as we go along. But overall, this attempt to work with misidentification doesn't seem to really work all that well. However, we still make false judgments. And like ordinary people, rational ordinary people, are still making false judgments. So it's not some weird thing that only a small subset of the population does it. No, we all do it. All right, so now, introducing the wax model of the mind, or if you like, the soul. Now, this notion of thinking that the mind is, a big block of wax, you find that throughout the history of Western thought, and you find it in some versions in Eastern thought as well. But in Western thought, thinking of the mind as a wax block, really, you find it in for example, St. Augustine, you find it in René Descartes, and you also find it and I indicate this with a kind of broken line, to a certain respect in British empiricism as well. So it cuts across a variety of philosophical positions or perspectives, if you like. So from Augustine over to Hume and Locke and the gang. And one of the things that the idea of the wax block stresses is that nature and experience makes imprints on you, right? Traces, as Augustine liked to call them, after images, as you find in Hume. Hume uses it at the very basis of his philosophy to distinguish, with impressions and ideas and all these kinds of things. It's all built on this rather metaphorical understanding of the mind as a kind of receptive, or a receptacle, if you like, but this receptive part of us that can have traces of experience written on it that we can then call up later, call those memories. In any case, it's a very famous image of the mind, and it's been very useful, so philosophers have used it in a variety of ways. Socrates is going to use it here. Once again, what are we doing? We're looking at the wax model to see if we can handle the notion of what false judgments are. So he says to Theaetetus, all right, Theaetetus, I'm going to introduce this wax model of the mind, and he sets it up. He gives it a little bit of an intro here. block of wax in the soul, and all of our perceptions and our thoughts, they leave their marks, like stamped impressions. So if you look at a ball or a block of wax and it's kind of warm and you have some sort of ring or whatever, you can stamp it in and it leaves that impression, trace, or a memory if you like. So impressions that remain, those are known and remembered. If the impression doesn't remain, then it's not remembered. And of course, Socrates says, but this metaphor is kind of helpful because some people have better memories than others. Some people learn faster. So now we have a bit of a model to handle ordinary experience in terms of, well, why do people learn at different rates? Why do some people have way better memories? Why do some people have faster memories, but not as long-lived? Well, Socrates introduces notions of, well, maybe the wax differs. Some people, the wax is very pure and very clean, and they remember things quite accurately. But maybe the wax is a little bit hard, so it's not very deep. So the memories don't last that long. Overwritten by other memories. Maybe some people have a little bit softer of wax, so the imprints are deeper, but maybe the wax isn't as pure and as clean. Maybe it has grit in it, and so their memories are longer lasting, but not as accurate. So it's interesting. Go through the text and look at how Socrates describes this ball of wax or this soul as wax, and see if you can figure out some other ways that it can be manipulated to or adjusted to explain our experience with learning and remembering. So clearly the notion of remembering is very important, and that alludes back to one of our interludes of the notion of memories being a key part of knowledge. All right, so after introducing the wax model and making a few statements about how it can be a good tool to explain a few things we see, 192A to 192C7, Socrates introduces an absolute welter of distinctions. And all these possibilities now of knowing, not knowing, remembering, not remembering, remembering clearly, all these kinds of distinctions. And it's a pretty dense little read. It goes quickly from one distinction to the next, and it's easy to get lost in what Socrates is doing. Like, why is he bringing all this up? This is just very confusing. And Theaetetus, needless to say, he's totally confused. Right? He's like, I haven't a clue what you're talking about. Like, what is this all about? And Socrates says, okay, well, he tries to slow down a little bit, but basically, it does admittedly roar along quite quickly. So my approach to this wax example is I want to introduce a few abbreviations. And so I'm going to deviate a little bit from the text, and I'm hoping that will shine a little bit of a light on what's going on here. But it is a very thorny passage. It's not always clear what's going on. And as we've seen, well, that's hardly a surprise. In several passages in the Theaetetus, the text may be corrupted, and it's not clear what's going on, even if the text isn't corrupted, and it's open to all kinds of interpretation. So what I'm trying to do is, without digging into too much of the details, I'm going to try and give you an idea as to why all these possibilities are laid out. There's going to be a lot of them. There's about 14 of them. They actually turn out to be impossible. They're possible permutations, but they turn out to not work for explaining false judgments. And then 3 seem to be possible, and then Socrates, well, to give away the punchline, Socrates is going to say, well, even with these 3, it doesn't seem to work as well as we would like, and then you can start getting into the interpretation of how it doesn't work and why and what are. I'll touch a little bit on that. But to keep things relatively clear, I'm going to start by introducing some abbreviations, and yes, I will deviate a little bit from the text, but hopefully it'll come out and be relatively clear. Now, the abbreviations that I want to introduce go something like this. And we've seen these kinds of abbreviations in our previous examples, but they're going to have to be a little bit more complicated. But let's hope not too much. So we'll start with, we have two things. I'm not going to say what they are, just two things. And they're different things, x and y. And so both x is a kind of thing, and so is y. And of course, x and y are different. All right, so we start with that. So, and we're just allowing the x and the y just to be variables. In other words, they can be filled in by different things, but they're some kind of thing. That's all we're worried about right now. So we have, in addition to this, with our wax model, we have three properties. Three properties, and their negations. Right, so we have knowing and not knowing, perceiving, not perceiving, and of course, remembering correctly and remembering or not remembering correctly. All right, so let's give our abbreviations here. So if I put a kx, that's going to be to know x. So that's my abbreviation. Kx just means know x. Nkx, well, that's not know x. Px, perceive x. Whatever x happens to be. Npx, not perceive x, or Cx is to remember correctly x, and then remember it's just property and a negation, property, negation, property, negation. And in this one, not remember correctly x. Okay, so with those, we can list, I'm not going to write them all out, I'll write a few of them out. So there's 14. So now we have, let's put this here, so we have 14 permutations. Is that all of the possible ones? Could you do any more? Socrates seems to think it's complete. It's arguable if it is. But again, I'm trying to stick relatively close to the text. Socrates has 14 permutations of what could be going on under this wax model. Well, in other words, you could know x, not be perceiving it, right? Because you could know it, but you're not perceiving it at a time. You could also be recalling x or Cx, right? You're remembering it correctly. You could know y, and you are recalling correctly y. You're not perceiving y, and you say x is equal to y. So that's, now what's going on here? Well, this is one of the permutations that he talks about. You could have these, these two things that you know, x and y, and you're not perceiving x, and you're not perceiving y, you're recalling x correctly, you're recalling y correctly, and then you say x is equal to y. That's a permutation, right? That's a possible permutation, but it turns out to be impossible for it to actually hold. So this is one use of a possible permutation that's involved in the wax example, but it's not going to occur. So you can rule that permutation out. So what he does is he goes through a number of these things. So I'll just write out a couple, and then I'll skip down to the other ones that he thinks are possible and why eventually he's going to rule them out as well. Okay, I got to keep all this straight here so it doesn't get too confusing. Anyways, this is a little bit of logic. Oh, there we go. So you know x, you you don't know why, and you're not recalling why, and you say that x is equal to y. So that's the general pattern. You have a bunch of you have a permutation of a number of these, right, in each of these, and at the end you identify them. And that's how we make, according to the wax model, that's one way we could make a mistake. And of course, as we've seen in these attempts to explain, it turns out that what the theory says, oh, this is how you make a mistake, turns out that we couldn't do it, right? We still make mistakes, but we couldn't make mistakes in the way as explained by the model. So same thing is going on here. So I'm going to go 3 and down, all the way down to the 14th. I'll write the 14th one out. So there's a bunch of these. You can go now through 190. Let me get the definite numbers correct again. 190A, 92A. So remember, that's what I'm talking about here. 192A to C7. That's where all this stuff is going on here to indicate what the permutations, possible permutations are, and Socrates just rules all of them out. So he goes through a number of possible permutations and goes, nope, not going to work, not going to work, not going to work. All right, so 14 of them, down to 14, which is nkx. And it's a good exercise just to go through this, and if you can follow and pick out more of them. So, as I said, I've given you 1, 2, 3 of them, but all of the ones from 3 to 13 I'm not writing out. See if you can figure them out for yourself. So nkx, npx, npy, and say that x is equal to y. All right, so impossible. So this is ruled out as impossible. It's not going to work. So these are the 14 permutations that he goes through in this 192A to C7, and he rules them out. And then he says, well, there seems to be 3 possible candidates. Right? So I'll just write them out and make a quick comment on them as to what Socrates concludes. X is equal to y. All right, so we have our 3 possible candidates now. 14 permutations, nope, not going to work. 3 permutations, they might work. Now, after all this heavy lifting, it's not really that heavy lifting once you just realize that he's just mixing and matching various possibilities to create all these permutations. Socrates says, looks like maybe we've got something here. Maybe we've got some way that, you know, you can know 2 different things and you're only perceiving one, and you say that x is y, and maybe that's how we make false judgments. Or you know one x and you're perceiving y, and then you say, oh, well, that's how we make false judgments. Or you know an x and you're perceiving the x, but you don't recall it clearly. You know the y, you're perceiving the y, you don't recall it clearly, and then you make the misidentification. So these are possible candidates for explaining how we make false judgments in the context of the wax example. So remember, it's always within the context of the wax example. These permutations are permutations of, that is, the various predicates that we talked about here, the things, and the predicates, the properties, within the context of the wax example. All right. Now, Socrates says, hey, it doesn't look too bad, but it seems that, so it's sort of what a quick upshot is that where errors are really happening is a little bit different than what we've seen before. Remember, previously I said that the error theory was trying to say you misidentify thought 1 with thought 2, or you misidentify perception 1 and perception 2. That seemed to run into trouble. So, what do we take away from that? Well, it seems that you can't get a good explanation of how we make false judgments if you assume that the error is made within one category, like between thoughts, confusing thoughts, or if you assume that the error is made in another category between perceptions. So the errors that we're making when we make false judgments, it's not confusing thought and thought or perception and perception, but maybe the error happens when you go across the categories. Instead of, again, not thought, thought, or perception, perception, but thought, perception, or perception, thought, or whatever. But one's from one category and you're identifying it with something from the other category. So you're identifying a known X with a perceived Y. Something like that. So cross categories. In other words, it doesn't happen when we're incorrectly linking thoughts to thoughts or perceptions to perceptions, but false judgments, so false judgments are not within a category, right? So in this one, right, thought 1 to thought 2, or perception 1 to perception 2, right? Because they're both in thought, both in perception. No, not this. Rather, cross categories. So you're a thought, so you're linking a thought to a perception. Something like that. Maybe that's what's going on, right? Something like this, right? Going from thoughts and you're crossing over in some kind of category. Maybe that's what's going on. Well, Socrates says, that sounds great. And then he says, but there are mistakes that we make that will not be captured by this model. And what does he say? Well, he says you can think about when the soul is worried about things internal to it, in thoughts, or it's reflecting on its own memories of its perceptions. And he says we often make mistakes internally. We make internal mistakes. It's not that our mistakes are always about the external world or whatever, or involving perceptions of the external world or what. We sometimes make errors right in the very depth of, shall we say, very abstract kinds of thinking, when it's really abstract thought making, or judgments about abstract thoughts and other abstract thoughts. We make mistakes in that area too. So this sounds, again, quite abstract, but Socrates gives us, fortunately, a fairly simple example. He says something like this. We make errors in thought about numbers. Now, for not numbers as in, like the number of objects on the table or whatever. He's not talking about that. He's talking about numbers in and of themselves. And according to the understanding that Plato and Socrates have of numbers, you don't perceive numbers in any way. These are, shall we say, non-empirical, non-sensual objects that you somehow grasp with the mind, like you grasp the notion of a triangle. But, every time I try and draw a triangle, that's not a real perfect triangle because, the lines have a certain amount of thickness and it's not, or that is not really a circle, right? It's sort of a lopsided thing. Again, it's not a perfect circle because it's not absolutely equidistant in all directions. I can't draw that. Nothing could equal, no physical representation could be perfect like a circle. And of course, numbers, if I write this on the board, you'd say, oh, that's the number 1, and that's 2. But wait a second, if I erase that, all I've done is erase the symbol of 1 or the symbol of 2. Why is that? Well, it just represents 1 and 2, just like I could have Roman numerals, right? So an ancient Roman would say, no, that's 2. And you say, no, that's 2. Well, neither is 2. Both of them are just representations of the concept of 2. Okay, now there is a debate about whether or not what I just said is perfectly accurate, but this is the model, again, within which Socrates speaks. So what's his point? It goes something like this. We make errors in thought regarding numbers. So it would be very easy to make a mistake of confusing, as you're in the depth of your soul thinking about numbers, confusing one number with another. We do that. Think about it. We could say something like this. You're not likely to confuse when you think about 2 and say, yeah, it's equal to 3. You're not likely to do that. But what you could do is, according to Socrates, is if you have very large numbers. That's where you could get into trouble. You might not confuse, you may not make mistakes like saying 2 plus 1 is equal to 6. No, you'd be pretty good with saying 2 plus 1 is 3. So you wouldn't confuse 2 and 1 with 6. You'd be very solid that 2 and 1 is 3. But imagine if I make the numbers much larger. Now remember, when you were very, very little, before you were good at counting and before you basically these little arithmetic propositions became embedded in your brain as just straightforward statements, so that if I say 2 plus 1, you automatically think 3. But you weren't born necessarily knowing that. You learned that. Now, suppose, though, I take very, very large numbers. Let's say I have, one really huge number, we'll call it, Q, and plus R. Let's say they're very, very, very large. Both of these are very large. Well, what's over here? You may not be able to immediately say. And you might get it wrong. You might, sum them up and you get it wrong. And, oh no, you were thinking of those two numbers. You were making mistakes with numbers. That's the key, is that you can make mistakes with numbers, right? That's something that's not going to be crossing a category, right? These are abstract thoughts and abstract thoughts. The wax example wants to say, the wax example wants to say that errors are committed when you cross categories. Now we're back to one of the old ones of saying, no, errors are committed within categories. So what's the upshot of all of this discussion? It seems once again, we have a model or a way of understanding error that might work a little bit, but it doesn't work here with thought when thought is dealing with numbers. So Socrates, he then concludes, well, looks like, my dear Theaetetus, it looks like the wax example crashes as well, because it can't handle something as fundamental as arithmetic. Maybe at the lower ends, maybe, but certainly not with large numbers. So the wax model crashes. All right, that's sort of my fairly straightforward, I hope, and relatively simple overview of what's going on in the wax example. So Plato has given us a lot to think about here, because you might say, well, the wax example will work in some cases, but not all cases. So maybe the wax example would invite us to reflect, to think that, well, maybe we can't have a single theory of false judgments. Maybe the wax example won't cover all false judgments, because maybe the wax example will work for some false judgments. Maybe when we confuse certain things that we think with certain things that we've perceived, we make those kinds of errors. Maybe the wax example works there, but that's going to tie or bring in or at least threaten to undermine other aspects of the dialogue, namely that the previous discussion of knowledge being found in aesthesis. So if you find false judgment when aesthesis is involved, which concerns perception, maybe you can find true judgment, and maybe that's going to be knowledge in aesthesis as well, but we seem to have ruled that out earlier. So Socrates got some motivation for saying, no, this wax example is not going to work, because it's going to drag knowledge as aesthesis back in or partly back in and disrupt the whole train of thought here. So what's really going on, again, is that you want a thesis or a theory of false judgment to cover not just part of an intended domain, but the whole thing, and to rule out what you don't want. You don't want it to start bringing false judgments into areas of human activity that involve perception, because that's going to then drag knowledge as his thesis back onto the table. And Socrates thought that he'd gotten rid of that. Remember, he spent, several pages trying to get rid of knowledge as his thesis. So, needless to say, exactly what's going on here has been a preoccupation of many scholars of Plato, trying to figure out exactly, how this works and what Plato thinks. But keep in mind that Plato in other dialogues does reject the notion of knowledge as applying to ordinary perception. So chances are he's going to reject the wax example in other dialogues as a good overall explanation of false judgment. So that's 4 down. We've seen the first 3 failed in previous videos. Now we've seen part 4, false judgments in the wax example. But again, we still make false judgments. That's a given, right? Socrates has not given that one up. And rational, normal, everyday, regular, whatever term you want to use for individuals, that they do make regular mistakes, right? It's not any kind of subset of the population or whatever. It's just everybody does it, right? So we need to find a theory that's going to work. Wax example is gone. What's next? Well, we go from thinking of the mind as a block of wax to the mind as an aviary full of birds. Stay tuned.